Cathedral in Edmonton, where we're working on the printing blocks from Trident Press in Winnipeg that were, I just want to go to my proper screen first as I start. There we go. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning, so now I'm hoping it'll be a lot smoother. We're working on the printing blocks from Trident Press and having saved them from a dumpster back in 2018. Together with Theo and Eric Fincham, I'm working towards the creation of a very large visual legacy project that will engage the community and honor the history of the Ukrainian press in Canada. I've always been fascinated by the process of creating imagery that can be reproduced and shared in a book or a newspaper or as a framed piece of art. Many of you know me as an artist, as a painter, as a watercolorist, but actually my formal training in the BFA program at the U of A was in printmaking. I explored lino cuts similar to those of Jacques Gnizdowski, but of course not as good. I spent hundreds of hours silk screening with my dad, Paul Sembaliuk, and I was so impressed by the etchings of Grigory Yakutovich from Ukraine that my final graduating project focused on the process of photo etching, where I superimposed photographs to create visual narrative. So it should come as no surprise to those of you to know that and hear that I was overwhelmed a couple of years ago in Winnipeg when I visited Trident Press and the home of Ukrainian Voice and found a basement full of nearly 100-year-old printing blocks. Each of the blocks that you see before you represents an image that was printed in either Grinsky Hollows, Ukrainian Voice, or in one of the many publications printed by the Ukrainian publishing company who later became Trident Press. Some of the oldest ones were actually hand-carved by the artists, and you would consider them original artwork. The others were collections. The others are a collection of artifacts that visually represent not only the stories that they supported, but also a physical documentation of the history of the print technology in Canada. They are extremely significant in many ways. For today's talk, I'm going to break up the presentation into 3 sections. First, I will take some time to contextualize this project by summarizing the history of Ukrainian press in Canada. I'll then familiarize you with the source of all these printing blocks that you see and how the blocks were created and used in the printing process. And then I'll conclude by turning my attention to sharing how we intend to create the mosaic and a digital interface that will become a way to share Ukrainian Canadian history with the public and in turn become a living legacy to the Ukrainian press in Canada. So I'd like to consider Ukrainians as the masters of communication and maintainers of continuity. Long before the arrival of Pilipiu and Ilignac to Canada, there's evidence of the role of the press to disseminate information, mobilize the population, and manage cultural focus in Ukraine. Just a quick search of the Internet Encyclopedia of Ukraine landed me on the page of the Lviv Dormition Brotherhood Press, founded in 1586. With a printing press and other equipment used by Ivan Fedorovich, it printed liturgical books, primers, poetry, dramas, and theological, educational, and polemic literature. Its oldest extant publications date from 1591. The power of the press grew in Ukraine, and during the mid-1800s, when the Austro-Hungarian aristocracy was in power and the native Ukrainian nobility and bourgeoisie had been assimilated by the Polish and Romanian upper classes within Ukrainian society, everything was starting to destabilize and deteriorate, and there was a lot of discontent with the social situation. Living conditions were unbearable, and out of the toiling class grew a rebellious movement that Antonio Gramsci would have referred to as an organic group of intellectuals. These emerging individuals rose from the ranks of specialized social groups and worked in opposition to the traditional ecclesiastic intelligentsia. They became community leaders that took upon themselves to initiate the founding of the Ukrainian language periodical press and to organize reading rooms in rural villages where peasants could meet, read, and learn about world issues. Since the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century up until the new millennia, print grew to be the dominant form of communication in all of Europe. Both text and images could stir the community and into a state of national awareness and societal identity. To understand this a bit better, the societal evolution via the press, you can also draw parallels to Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, where he points out that the press and evolutionary vernacularization has been one of the major contributing factors to the rise of national consciousness. He noted that if it is written in the common language, it will be read and ultimately discussed. Prior to the digital era, print languages, not just text printed, but images as well, created unified fields of exchange and communication. And I feel that the Ukrainian press did exactly that. Printed in a common language that could be read by everyone, not just the Church Slavonic, which was reserved for the church officials. The leadership role of the press in Ukraine emerged in the 1800s from an existing artisan movement in Lviv, and although not craftsmen in the strictest sense, the printers and the typesetters played an important role in mobilizing the intelligentsia and village peasants. In addition, coinciding with a growing nationalist movement, by 1880, periodicals began to adopt a pure Ukrainian vernacular language and publish topics of general interest. For example, there was the publication of folklore, songs, proverbs, illustrated narratives, and editorial cartoons, such as those created in Kalush in Western Ukraine that mocked the renowned Ukrainian choreographer Vasil Avramenko. They all helped establish a national Ukrainian identity. The formation of reading clubs, including Prosvita and the Krachkovsky Society, also reinforced the role of the press in improving social standards. Subsequently, it was the press that printed the posters that you see before you, the flyers, the booklets that influenced the mass migration to Canada, and with the new settlers came an established print tradition. Between 1900 and 1913, Canada's population exploded, and thousands of immigrants from all over flooded the country, answering the Canadian government's invitation to populate the West. A lot of the new settlers moved around major cities, as we know, to Edmonton, Saskatoon, Winnipeg, and these settlers were the others, and their so-called ethnic newspapers were the cornerstones of immigrant communication. Publishing in the voices of their homelands, the multilingual press was in a position to give effective assistance to newcomers. Weekly newspapers and yearly almanacs maintained a link to the old country and provided local news to their language and dialect, in their own language and dialect. In addition, whereas the majority of early immigrants were tillers of the soil, the periodicals served as a bridge between peasant roots and unfamiliar urban environment. Each ethnic community produced periodicals on a regular basis, and by 1914, the Ukrainian Canadian community had no fewer than 15 Ukrainian language newspapers and corresponding yearly almanacs published in Canada, and the majority of those were out of Winnipeg. This isn't unusual or unexpected to those of us who know Ukrainian Canadian history. Coming out of Winnipeg was one of the major urban centers of Ukrainian settlement in Canada. As noted previously, prior to the first wave of Ukrainian immigration, there was already a strong print tradition in Ukraine, and it transferred over. And members of both the Ukrainian intelligentsia and the ecclesiastic community immigrated, bringing with them their strong convictions, and were motivated to continue spreading the word in the press. For those of you who are interested specifically in the history of the Ukrainian press in Canada and all of the details, and there's a lot of them. There's an excellent essay by Yuri Dashko and Manuli Lupul's A Heritage in Transition, which is a good starting point. For today's lecture, I'd like to focus on the Canadian periodical Grinsky Hollows, Ukrainian News, and the Ukrainian Publishing Company of Canada, which later became, in 1949, became Trident Press. The company published the Ukrainian Voice as well as many other independent publications, which are the source of our printing blocks. The inception of the Ukrainian Voice and the company goes back to the Ruthenian Training School that was established in 1905 by the Manitoba provincial government. It was put in place to produce young teachers for the schools that were coming up in the rural communities throughout the province. In the text, the multilingual press in Manitoba, Michael Hikavi, the editor, noted that these teachers of the Ruthenian Training School were men who came from Western Ukraine with the equivalent of a high school education or better, but they just were without the sufficient knowledge of the English language. Hikavi went on to describe the young men, the Ukrainian students, aspiring teachers, as enterprising, ambitious, devoted to their people and their material and intellectual welfare, and they were prepared to give leadership in the efforts to organize cultural societies. In 1909, the first convention of these teachers was held in Winnipeg, and it was determined at that time that the most important matter at hand was to educate the community as a whole and to establish and create a weekly newspaper that would serve the people on a cultural and educational basis. Although a few other Ukrainian languages newspapers already existed in Canada, it was felt that the top three, one was too political, one was a church paper, and the third was a socialist publication, and none of those met the teachers' needs. So a group of them got together and collaborated financially and physically to support the Teachers Initiative, and on the 16th of March, 1910, the Ukrainian Voice was formed. The first editor was Vasil Kudryk, manager was Taras Verley, treasurer was Vasil Chumer, and the board of directors were all school teachers. They were incorporated as the Ukrainian Publishing Company of Canada Limited. Now, like always in the publishing business, those of you who are involved, things were difficult financially at the beginning and continued on. Subscriptions were hard to sell at first, but they started with a typesetting and a printing on a platen press that was done, that was held and housed at the home of Yakio Kret. He had a small print shop of his own. He wasn't formally part of the printing company, but he lent the press. Over time, subscriptions grew, and Ukrainian Publishing Company was able to buy their own press and their own lead type in Cyrillic, and they moved to 214 Dufferin Avenue. They purchased an old linotype, which was in 1916, and that allowed them to set type faster, and their issues grew from 8 pages to 12. During the early years, Kudryk was the editor, and the foundation of the paper was based on the ideology of self-reliance, self-confidence in regard to national affairs. There was a focus on preserving culture and building a strong organizational network. In 1921, Vasil Kudryk stepped down to become a priest, and the post was filled by a very active journalist and influential speaker, Miroslav Sticeshin. He held the position until 1947, after the World War II. Sticeshin built upon the foundation laid by his predecessor. He produced the issues himself with only sporadic assistance from other journalists. He continued to print 12 pages weekly, and he increased the content. It was primarily news from across Canada, but he also expanded it to include contributions from all the communities across Canada, from each of the provinces. Also from farmers. There's a farmers section, a women's section, a youth section. They printed a novel by installments, and he increased advertising. Following Cheladyn, who stepped down due to health issues, there was a succession of editors, and I'm not going to go through that history, but I do want to note that there were two managers who kept the printing process up to date with technology and were responsible for the creation of the printing blocks in this collection. They were Wojtsenko, who managed the floor for 43 years from 1913 to 56, and Siernik, who managed it from 56 to 73, at which time the printing process changed and so did the managers. For those of you who are interested in more history about Grinsky Hollows, I thought there is online a short history. It's called Ukrainian Voice, Ukrainian Voice, a short historical survey. It was updated and uploaded in 2009. In the course of my research, I have found that Cheladyn's appointment as editor back in 1921 was helped by the printing, I found out that finding out more about Cheladyn, who was editor starting in 21, it put the printing blocks that we have into even greater context and explained the variety of themes behind the images. In the short weeks we've had working with them here, we've come to realize that many of the image blocks seem to come from publications other than the Ukrainian Voice newspaper. Because the newspaper was printed very few images, that tends to make sense. More significantly, Trident Press printed a variety of publications, books, pamphlets that were brought to the press through an alliance that was formed between many of the Ukrainian organizations, such as the Ukrainian Fraternal Society, the Ukrainian Self-Reliance League, and the Ukrainian Women's Association of Canada, and the Ukrainian Museum of Canada. Each contributed to Hollows, the newspaper, but also had publications printed in the Ukrainian Publishing Company and Trident News. A further note, and the reason why I've put up the slide here of Sembaliuk, Cheladyn, and Olena Kiselevska is that we've noticed in this short time that the majority of the blocks that we have been able to process so far, they were published by women's organizations, specifically the Ukrainian Women's Association of Canada and the museum. And this can partially be explained by the fact that during his time as editor, Cheladyn hired his sister-in-law, Sembaliuk Cheladyn, a home economist from Saskatchewan, and she contributed articles about and related to domestic science in the women's section of Hollows. And it was Sembaliuk that had invited Olena Kiselevska from Lviv to contribute articles related to Ukrainian folklore, particularly about textiles, embroidery, and weaving. The images we found were always included in women's sections or women's publications, and Sembaliuk's role in the formation of the women's group and museum and her direct connection to the printer facilitated the printing of several popular publications that are still found in homes today. I've got 4 of them up on the screen. Mistetsky Skarby, Ukrainsky Vishevok, Ukrainian Traditional Cookery, which is now I've seen online on Kijiji for $1,000. Ukrainian Embroidery Designs and Stitches, and Ukrainska Zhinka Choreography, Ukrainian Women in Choreography. So we've got a lot of blocks related to these books. Over the years, the Ukrainian Voice and Trident Press had its ups and downs and eventually saw a steady decline in the popularity of the Ukrainian Voice newspaper. In general, partially due to competition across the country, printers were available in BC, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. You didn't have to send your work to Winnipeg, and there was a growing lack of use of Ukrainian, but as experienced by all newspapers around the world, evolving technology was moving media and communication into a digital era, and by 2018, the age of printed news had become a shadow of its past. So now, with the context being established, I'd like to move to the actual printing box that we salvaged. Early in 2018, it was decided to liquidate Trident Press. And in August of 2018, Ukrainian Voice printed its final issue. This meant that the publishing house had to be cleared out. And I heard that there were books being given away, piled up in the basement. And I found myself there with people like Roman Yereniuk, James Komanowski, Boris Matinovich. We were like magpies. We were hoping to find something shiny that we could preserve. So here's a slide of what we found down there. It was a crumbling, dirty floor. It had a 6.5-foot ceiling, no lights. They'd strung an extension cord you can see on the floor. And as we walked through the basement, we had to hold a trouble light to be able to see. And there were hundreds of boxes. And this was the treasure that I stumbled upon. We figured there must have been at least 4,000 printers' blocks representing 100 years of print history. Each block, and you can see some down at the bottom of the slide, was a solid piece of hardwood, and to the top of it was glued an image, either hand carved, etched on copper or zinc, or carved out of linoleum. These blocks, let's see if I can show it. Okay, we moved these blocks. They came in 2 pallets. They were 1,500 pounds each. And unfortunately, we did not find any of the Cyrillic lead. It was apparently sold for salvage. It's a shame. However, if you accept the saying that a picture is worth 1,000 words, then we have more than enough to tell a story. I have a short video of how a letterpress works that I can share later if there's time. But right now, I would like to move on to show you some of the blocks. And as I talk, I'm going to show a video that I have to set up. I'm going to switch from sharing this to my video. Here we go. So most of the blocks that we found for the newspaper headers were used repeatedly for the newspaper and title pages of almanacs that repeated themselves from year to year. But for the most part, each block was used only once. And we wondered, why did the publisher save so many if it was used only once? Well, perhaps if you've ever been an author or a member of an organization, there's always hope. And I want to just do that for a second. So there's always hope that one of the titles will become popular and go into a second edition, which was the case of traditional Ukrainian cookery, which between 1957 and 1980 was reprinted 11 times. But there's also the tangible and intangible culture attached to the blocks, as well as the embodied memories that each block represents. And I think we come from a culture that inherently feels it has to save things that tell a story. The blocks are a visual history of the Ukrainian community across Canada. The images document the events and achievements and the people who contributed to our social, political, and religious milieu. In some cases, they illustrate a process or celebrate a milestone. The images on each block were created by a photographer or an artist, and in some cases are the original artwork. And we found some already, created by Vadim Dobrylij, Myron Levitsky, and Jacques Gniezdowski. Each block was created by a gifted craftsman who was able to take a drawing or photograph and transpose it onto copper or make a zinc plate so that it could be reproduced hundreds or sometimes thousands of times. And the whole collection that we have represent the evolution of the printing press as it exists in the many ethnic communities and organizations across Canada. Unfortunately, although each block embodies such precious memories and intangible cultural heritage associated with production, the reality is that due to volume and weight, it has been difficult and impossible to find a home in a museum or archives. So to preserve them indefinitely, simply as artifacts, is pretty much an unsustainable idea. Well, I'll just let everyone know that we packed up everything and we've decided and are proposing to use the blocks, large and small, to create a mosaic that'll be installed in a prominent indoor location. Ideally, we're looking at doing it in Ottawa, a national home for a national project. And also for a national newspaper. Not only would it be a pretty piece of art, we're preparing to include a digital interface that will allow people to interact with the images and learn about their source and inspiration. We packed them up and I've assembled a team to work on the project, which includes myself and Theo Sembaliuk and Eric Fincham. The next slide I want to show is Theo. Theo and I are both accomplished artists that have made our mark in the community. Theo began her post-secondary education in Ottawa and did the summer program at Harvard in '92. She has her Bachelor of Fine Arts from the U of A, which she got in '96, and she studied mosaics with Sonia King in Oakland, California, with Luciana Noturni in Ravenna, Italy, and with Derry Drossil, who did a large-scale mosaics project in Chicago. You might be familiar with some of Theo's works in that she has, here in Edmonton at St. Rose Junior High School, an exterior mosaic. St. John's Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral has a large indoor legacy mosaic. Royal Alexandra Hospital has mosaics in the quiet room and in triage. And in Giovanni Cuboto Park and at the Italian Center, you can see her work down in Little Italy. When it comes to mosaics, Theo has a lot of experience. The other person on our team is Eric Fincham. Eric is our project archivist. I met Eric at the Cool Folklore Center, where he's been working with the Bogdan Medvitsky Ukrainian Folklore Archives on and off since 2015. I've learned that he completed an undergraduate degree in history and political science in 2014, and then went on to finish a master's in library and information studies at the U of A as well. Upon graduation, Eric was chosen to participate in an internship program with the Smithsonian Institution Archives in Washington and returned to Edmonton with a wealth of knowledge that we're going to tap into. With the rollback of activities on campus due to COVID, it's timely that he's now available to come on board to work on cataloging. Eric is going to work with us on the printing blocks and saving them from destruction. We've divided the project into 3 parts: cataloging, which involves correlating them with the publications that they were printed in and creating the metadata that goes with each block. We're also then, the next phase will be creating the mosaic, where we'll try to find an aesthetically pleasing composition and also a didactic narrative. And then the third part will be to create the digital interface, which I have a little bit of an example. So if we've got a mural and click on one of them, tiles on when you're online, you'll get the information about them. You can then switch and click on another and get the more metadata that we've collected. We'll tell you where the block came from, who the artist was, what information went along with, if there was a caption with that particular image. So Theo is here with me today, and I'd like to turn it over to her for a few minutes to share some of the challenges we've identified coming with this project. Go ahead, Theo, take it away.
Thank you, Larissa. It's so lovely to be here and to be a part of this project. It's really exciting. When Larissa approached me and was explaining it to me, I don't know that I completely and fully grasped what it was until all the boxes showed up to my garage. So opening the boxes up and looking inside and taking a look at these were, oh my gosh, it was like Christmas. So as a mosaic artist, this spoke volumes for me, because when you're creating a mosaic, the material itself is just as important as the image in my work anyway. So all of these pieces become the tessera, or the structure for this. So going through all the pieces, what we had to identify first is if everything, the images even worked for all of it, and could we use all the images. But unfortunately for many of the blocks, they're unidentifiable or overly used, so they're really not identifiable. But this actually didn't present itself as too much of a problem, because when we assemble the blocks, we can use both the images of the ones that the images is still intact, with the backs or the sides of these pieces, because the wood is really beautiful, with various types of wood, and various types of the wood has been assembled on the back. Some also being just completely metal. So we're going to play around when we assemble with using the front and the back, sometimes the side, so depth will become a component for the design, which I'm quite excited about. The layout. So this is the other part I'm really excited about, because when Larissa categorized all of these pieces, she has them by portraits, by art, by embroidery, design, and a gazillion other categories. So it will come down to laying everything out and trying to figure out how we want these pieces to dance together, really. So do we want the panels to each be separated by category, or an overlap, or a Shevchenko piece, or so this will be part of our play, I suspect, when we're laying everything out and trying to figure that out. Another option that has cropped up is whether or not we make one big, huge piece, although now that I'm beginning to grasp the enormity of it, I almost think that would be impossible. So breaking it up into pieces that could be housed in different parts of Canada would be really exciting, I think, too, because having as many people enjoy these as possible would bring such a thrill. And we've had people who want it, so that's quite exciting too. We have requests. We might have to put a call out, a competition. How bad do you want this? So, and the last obstacle that we've come across is longevity. Unfortunately, the zinc is beginning, and the metals, some of them are beginning to oxidize, and so having to figure out how to protect them and make them archival will be interesting. We'll have to varnish the wood. There's so many different things that are going to be required in terms of salvaging and keeping these from any more further deterioration. Also, making them movable and removable has been important, because as some of you may know, I created a 386 square foot mosaic on the side of St. John's Institute, which was done in 3 phases, but was created and installed directly onto the building, which now, as the building has been sold or is being sold, many people ask what will happen to it, which I have no control over, obviously. So these pieces will be mounted on panels that will be movable as well. So that's a nice part of this as well. So I think that's about it. Hey, Larissa?
Yeah, that covers what we found out so far. There'll be lots of things along the way. So I've come to the end of the presentation, and I would like to point out, and I'm going to share one more screen with you. Make sure it pops up. Yep. So we've become aware of a lot of things, and what we're working on is a remediation project. And basically that's where you take something that was produced in one media or one form of communication and transform it into another. So we're taking printing blocks to make a mosaic, which will then become a digital interface. And there's some things we have to be aware of when we do that. How does the process, how will the process change the message that each book was originally meant to convey, because they won't have the captions anymore. How are people going to interpret them? Is there going to be many meanings now to that picture, as if there weren't before, but obviously so now? How will we handle blocks that reflect colonialism or racism or discrimination when they were printed 100 years ago? What are the benefits and disadvantages to a digital interface when we get to that point? And what ongoing expenses will be incurred to preserve this visual legacy when it becomes a mosaic? Theo addressed some of those. So I'm going to put this slide up just for a second. And that in closing, I just want to acknowledge the people here who have helped with all the research in the past about the press in Canada and in Ukraine, the Folklore Center, the Bogdan Meditsky Archives, and especially I have to thank the Shevchenko Foundation, the Veterans Fund, for understanding what we are planning to do and funding us over the next 3 years. They're kicking in quite a substantial amount. Our project budget is $120,000, and they've agreed to cover half of it. So thank you very much to them. And I will now open the floor up to any questions. I hope we've left enough time.
Yes, we have, 15 minutes for sure, and we already have several questions from the audience. Are you ready, okay, Larissa? So Ivania Chernyak says, this is a fascinating information, Larissa. Will the blocks be preserved for all time, and where will they be kept?
Okay, we've decided that when they become those that we've choose to become a mural or the mosaic will be preserved in one particular way. And so that, as Theo said, we have to think about how we're going to do that, and they will be removable in case of, things change as far as their location. We will also be setting aside ones that we feel should be preserved in a museum or a part of an archive, because they represent, like there are a couple that were hand carved by the artist, and they are the original artwork, or they represent a particular type of technology that should be saved. So that they'll either be part of the mosaic or preserved in an archive.
Another question is from Ihor Michalcheshin. Who carved or created the images on the blocks?
Can you repeat that?
Who carved or created the images on the blocks?
It varied. In the beginning, in the 1920s, it would have been the original artist. So we have found some where it's actually lino cut, and the artist, I know that Jacob Majdanek actually did some of them. Unfortunately, those ones I know were also destroyed several years ago accidentally, but the artist would have done them. Otherwise, it would have been a technician, a craftsman, who transferred whatever artwork or photograph that was provided with the text. They would have transferred it with a process, an etching process, onto the plates. And that would have been, in the beginning, one of those two production managers probably had a lot of hands-on work with it.
Thank you, Larissa. The next question is from Iraida Vinnitska. At the UCRDC in Toronto, we have inherited from Pan Rosocha Vilne Slovo, a collection of similar blocks. Any suggestions what we should do with them?
Well, I think ideally, in an ideal world, we would have a place where we could collect and store them. I've, in my research, found a couple of universities around the world. There's one in Japan, one in China, a couple in the States, who are actually preserving these. They're creating, they're cleaning them, they're creating archival drawers for them. They're being, all the metadata related to them is being stored with the scans of them, but they take up a lot of space. I would suggest something similar to what we're doing as far as documenting them, scanning them, and then physically using them to create something more permanent and more easily shared and stored. Because once you store them in drawers, it's difficult to share them. But by creating mosaic or something, a public peace with them, you are sharing to the world again.
Thank you. Irene Mazurenko is asking, who owns the copyright to the images?
The images by copyright law are owned by the artist or the family up until 50 years after their death. And so the actual image, we can't reproduce them because they are by those standards. So if the artist hasn't passed for more than 50 years or doesn't give permission, the family doesn't give permission within that time frame, we cannot reproduce them. But the printing blocks themselves are owned by whoever paid to have them made. So in some cases it was Trident Press because they produced and published many of their own publications, or Soyuz Ukrainian owned the printing blocks, or an author may own them and has left them behind, and then there's a statute of limitations on things left behind. So the actual blocks have an owner and also have a statute of limitations that go with those. These ones were all discarded at Trident Press, so the copyright related to the blocks is what we're dealing with, as long as we don't reproduce them.
So I guess that answers Christine Habrovich's question. Could these blocks be used to print on fabric, like tote bags,
They
etc.?
would, and we've toyed around with all the different ideas. Theo and I, being printmakers, that's the first thing we wanted to do was ink them up and test them up on a press. There's nothing stopping us from approaching the families and the artists to get permission in the future to do that. I think it's a lovely idea. It would be fun to play with them and do things, but we're going to focus right now on making sure that we've preserved them and found a way to share them with the public.
The next question is slightly related. The answer is from Ivania Chernyak. I would also love to see a book made and published featuring the most beautiful of the blocks, including a history of the Ukrainian pressing press. Is a book being planned?
A physical book is way off in the future. I suppose we're collecting all the material for it. We will create the digital interface first. And that will probably be like a website, and there will the history of the Ukrainian press would be included in that. But as far as physically printing the book, that is will be an extension of the project and probably more fundraising and more addition to the team of people working on it. Lovely idea, we like it, but we got to do it one step at a time.
Oksana Kurelev is asking if they will ever go for sale.
If they will ever what?
Go for sale, the blocks.
I don't think so. Maybe we did have an idea of using the mosaic as a fundraiser, and you could have your name attached. You could contribute money, and we could say such and such a block by Jacques Gnizdowski, one of them. The donor's name is attached to that block, much like you have on brick buildings. You know, the bricks on buildings. We could approach this as a fundraising mosaic, but I don't think physically I personally don't want to see them separated anymore. They belong as part of a collection.
That's right. We have two overlapping questions, so I'm going to read both, and I hope you can answer. Ivania Chernyak is asking, can you also create a separate touring mosaic that can travel to various places throughout Canada and the world? And Arlene Tomnyuk is asking, do you have plans for some type of traveling exhibit?
I suppose that's always possible. We're hoping that the virtual interface, the website we create out of it will be the extension globally to begin with. I think having seen how those mosaics are moved, that Theo has moved, they are extremely heavy, they're fragile. She's shaking her head agreeing, yes. I don't know if we would physically move a mosaic around, but we could take photos of it and create something down the road. There are a lot of options in that regard.
Roman Yerenyuk has a question, and I know you have the answer. Did you ever think of taking an issue of Grinsky Hollows and matching the 20-30 images from the blocks, always in reverse?
Well, we have almost done that with 4 or 5 of the books already. Just in this short time, Eric and I have pulled the ones that were the most obvious, and we matched to the block to the book. So Sembaliuk's Ukrainian cookery, traditional cookery, we've done that book already, a couple of others. And I don't know if Larissa Talpesh is one of our guests today, but she visited us yesterday and said, oh, bring out some of those Ukrainsky Hollows and I'll start matching them. And that would be the ideal. So you would be able to see on the mosaic or in the digital interface, you could click on it and it would tell you what issue it appeared in and who the photographer was or whatever, all the information associated and the article that went with the image. It's an ideal, Roman. We definitely want to do that for at least a couple of issues.
And just to add to that, the University of Manitoba Library is also considering digitizing the entire run of the Ukrainian Voice. So hopefully that will be available online sometime in the future.
And I hope that this project can help with that. I talked to James last week about it. They had already prepared to start digitizing before the COVID lockdown of the archives. So it's serendipitous that their work and ours is coinciding and we'll be able to maybe link to what they've scanned. So you can go to the actual page down the road.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Catherine Limberty. Are you considering collaborations with some of the other German, Swedish, etc. language newspapers published in Western Canada that would have similar printing blocks?
Yes. When we originally found the blocks and I didn't know what there was there, I thought that it would be a wonderful tribute to the press in Canada to create a multicultural mosaic, and we could put, and we're in our infancy with the design stage of it, that we could probably do that if we were able to find other collections and they were willing to share towards this project. That way, too, a home in Ottawa would really make sense for the main piece, a big multicultural tribute to the press in Canada, and then we could build on the satellite ones. One would be like The Voice and the other would be the whispers that happen in the community.
Thank you. And the last comment, or rather request from Ivana Chernyak. Good to hear you will be looking to house mosaics throughout Canada. Please ensure at least one is featured in Calgary, perhaps in the new Arts Center.
Oh, what a great idea.
Yeah.
Theo,
so this is...
Well, I think the thought of having these in so many different homes is so exciting because there are so many blocks that we have the opportunity and the gift of quantity to do so many different things that it doesn't all have to follow one format. So I thought that's really exciting.
Well, and what's nice is that there are overlapping stories. Mm-hmm. that will surface out of this kind of a project, stirring up memories, making connections. Mm-hmm. That's what we really like about this project.
Mm-hmm. We got a new question from Ashley Halko-Edley. Does using the blocks compromise preservation?
Does what?
Using the blocks compromise preservation of them?
Not in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. Theo and I are very aware that we have to preserve them in some way. If they're glued to the back of to a surface, they will no longer be able to be used as printing blocks, what they were originally used for. However, some of them are in such bad state that in our process of creating the mosaic and treating them, we will be preserving them better than they ever have been in the last 100 years. So, we have to compromise. as it goes, because there's no home for them. Nobody wants them in this big, huge, massive, heavy collective state. They were going to be thrown in a dumpster. It was parked outside the building. So I think the mosaic is preserving them a lot.
Turning them into something so beautiful. Like they're going from being housed in boxes to being cleaned and bathed and washed and then considered and gently handled. Like I don't think there's any compromise there at all. Like they're being brought back to life.
That's a good way of putting it.
Ashley has a follow-up. I'm just wondering if an interactive wall where people could come and make print copies on them could be an option.
You could definitely come and do etchings off of them, like in some places in India where you can go and you can take a piece of paper and you can do a rubbing. That will definitely be possible. And I don't think we would want anybody to deface them by putting ink on them, but we could encourage the rubbing to happen.
Thank you, Larissa. And I would like to finish with Oksana Kurelev's comment. Thank you, Larissa and Theo, for a very informative session, an exciting endeavor. Good luck.
Thank you, Oksana.
Okay. Thank you, Larissa. And this is the end of, yes, this is the end of our presentation today. Thank you all for coming. If you have any more questions, please email them to us. We can share with Larissa anytime. Thank you.
And I apologize for all the technical difficulties, but I think we're all getting used to it. It's part of the folklore that we're establishing.
Life happens.
Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you very much.